All right. Welcome, everyone. I think we've got a good quorum of folks with us today. And I am Tim Erlin. I'm the VP of Product at Wallarm, and I'm thrilled that you've decided to join us today for a conversation, a workshop around API threat modeling. And I'm joined today by Bob Clinton, who is the field CTO at Driven.tech. Bob, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Great to be here.
Yeah, thrilled to get this conversation started. And where else are we going to start on this topic with other than just starting with defining what threat modeling is? I think that's a good place to start. So we'll start the conversation by talking a little bit about what we mean when we say threat modeling. We've got a slide with a definition, as you might expect. Always good to start with that. But Bob, I think maybe in your own words, or you can use the words on the slide if you like. I won't keep you from that. From your perspective, when you talk about threat modeling with people and sort of what we're talking about, what is it? How do you define it for folks?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great definition to work from, but as an overview, I think we get very much interested in bogged down into the technology and kind of doing our little piece of what we're supposed to do, and this is an opportunity to kind of take a step back and make sure that we're doing things like secure by design and really understanding what is the impact of changes we're making, whether that be in code or in infrastructure, and really understanding when it's kind of free to change on a whiteboard or in a design session versus months later when it's out in production and we find these logic flaws. It's really it's a lot better to fix it early in the process.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. I often find when I'm when I'm talking about threat modeling or when I see it used in the context of cybersecurity, that it feels like it's sort of an esoteric process or a process that's limited to people who've been trained in it somehow. And I often have to remind myself that human beings are built for modeling threats. I mean, we do it all the time, every day. And so there's a part of me that wants us to sort of emphasize that threat modeling is something anyone can do. And it's not as complicated as you think it is, and you can make it complicated, but you should also keep in mind that you can do threat modeling, sort of every day, all the time. In fact, we do, right? Yeah,
Yeah, I think coming out of the cave and looking left and right to see if there's any saber-toothed tigers around, we've been doing this for a while.
that's right. Yep, that's a perfect example. Absolutely. Cool. So when we talk about threat modeling, there are some principles that we want to keep in mind. Described here on this slide. Bob, you want to walk through the principles that we have in mind here?
Sure. Yeah, and this is really pulled from the Threat Modeling Manifesto, which is a great, easy to read document. There's whole books written about this, but I think if you're just getting started with this, the Threat Modeling Manifesto is a great place to start. And it's really, the principles that we're looking at are really when should we do this? And it's never really done. The earlier you can do it, the better in the process. But if you're making a change, it's a great time to reevaluate what you're doing. Um,
Yeah.
and I think as we move through there, the who kind of stands out to me as well. You mentioned it's for everybody. We tend to kind of let security architects and people that have been doing this for 20 or 30 years take the reins and do these types of things. But it's really open to any stakeholders. There's different perspectives. People see things and business impacts and technology impacts differently, and I think it's an opportunity to collaborate with a broad team and just get all those different perspectives. And that's how we find these things before the bad guys do.
Yeah. I think those are important points to point out. I mean, the how and the what. I think we'll talk a lot about the how in this workshop itself. I guess I want to emphasize the early and often component there under when, because threat modeling, while we can build it into a practice, that practice is most effective if it's done frequently. And certainly if it's done early in the process of developing and deploying, a new capability or a new product or a new feature. We want threat modeling to be an upfront process as opposed to an after the fact process.
Absolutely. But
Mhm.
if you got to do it late, it's better than never, right?
That's right. The best time to do it is yesterday, and the second best time is today.
Right.
Yeah. That's an important point, actually. Not to gloss over it. Just because you didn't get that threat modeling done early in the cycle doesn't mean you should give up on it. It's not a lost cause. In fact, threat modeling on existing things that are already deployed is perfectly fine. It is, as we just said, the second best time to do it. Yeah, awesome. So, and I guess that sort of leads us to this slide. The threat modeling values, and we'd broken this down as sort of good and better. Um, what's the difference between these two columns, Bob? Why did we put up two columns here for good and better?
Sure. So everything on the left side is good, right? It's not a bad thing to be compliant. It's not a bad thing to talk about threat modeling, but it's much better to do threat modeling. It's much better to have a culture of finding and fixing issues versus, hey, this is what the compliance framework says we should be doing, and we, by the letter of the law, did that, right? Those are all good things, but it's better to have that creative mind and that crowdsourcing ability to say, look, I'm not a developer, but I understand the business impact if we lose this component of the application, and those that input from those folks, and having that confidence and that open dialogue with all types of different folks, I think is better, right? So this is, we're kind of saying, nothing's on the left is really bad, right? They're all good things,
Yep.
but to really kind of get the most value out of anything like this, it's really got to be in that right column.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of the phrase don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Like
Yeah.
you're better to get started, but you can always improve. Continuous refinement, I could interpret that as continuous improvement, right? Start
Totally.
now, do what you can, but understand that you can target a better approach and a better process down the road.
In the journey of understanding, I think that's one as well. I don't know how you feel about that one, Tim, but it's, we all have these different perspectives. When we can collaborate, we can start to see where those perspectives are coming from, and
Hmm.
and really make this iterative, but also build on what we did yesterday and the day before.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's valuable. That's valuable. And you've got compliance up here under good. As you said, compliance isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. Um, I I have been over many years interested, fascinated, I don't know what the right word is, in the ability for compliance to drive meaningful change. And not that the compliance itself is the change, but that it provides the catalyst, the motivation, often the budget to implement something valuable and useful for an organization. So don't be afraid of using compliance as a reason to drive threat modeling. Um, and know that you can go beyond just the compliance once you've got it in place, once you've got the process started. So
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to start the conversation with compliance because it gives you a foundational level, right? We have to do this or we're going to get a fine or go to jail or,
yeah,
have to close the doors of the business. But I think it's like, what's the difference between the law and ethics and, that type of stuff? It's the law, or compliance is a foundational layer. It's a bare minimum, right? This is
sure.
what you should be doing. Um, to be a good steward of the environment. And then as you progress up, there's a lot more you can do on top of that compliance level. And I think that's where some of these types of, you know,
Yeah,
services and programs come into place.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so when we talk about approaching threat modeling, there are four key questions, and these, sort of lead to something as the arrows imply. Why don't we go through these four key questions? What is this? What are we working on? I think that's a simple question to start with. What are we talking about with that question? What is that really about?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, we gotta draw a boundary around something, right? To start with, we can't have everything in scope. So we really want to understand and get agreement within the group. What are the boundaries? What's the scope of what we're talking about?
And that scope becomes incredibly important as you explore the potential threats, because some of those threats, some of those targets, if they're outside the scope, then you don't need to spend the time on them in this threat modeling exercise. It gives you that boundary, as you said. Yeah. And so the next one down, what can go wrong? That really is about threat, right, Bob?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really about thinking like an attacker, thinking, knowing what you know about the internal workings of this application or this system. What are some of the crown jewels? What are some of the exploitable interfaces? What could someone or what would motivate someone to do something here? And what could go wrong?
Yep. And scope and threats, are part of the equation, but you've also got to be able to talk about what you're going to do about it. And to me, this is a key component, or a key question for threat modeling is that action, that decision, that mitigation that you're going to take. I think that's valuable.
Sure. Yeah. Are we just analyzing what can go wrong and listing those, or are we going to actually take action on it?
Yeah, it always reminds me of security controls or tools that are detection capabilities only. They tell you there's a problem, but they don't do anything about it. In which case, you have to do something. You're the mitigation.
Yeah.
But if you don't come up with mitigation, the threat modeling is incomplete, if you will.
Yeah.
And then this last one, I think people often forget about the last one. You can do scope, threat, and mitigation and feel like you've done a pretty good job, but you're leaving out a last step, or a last key question, as the case may be.
Yeah, and this can take many forms. This could be maybe we implemented some tool, API security tool or something like that, and we're going to go through and we're going to check the information, the telemetry that's coming out of that, the logging that's coming out of that. Maybe it's a purple team exercise where we're going to try to uh, do some of these attacks and see what the results are, where we're able to block it, detect it, et cetera. But I think matters less the form it takes and just kind of it more is the emphasis of this is never really done. Let's measure what we did and then take it through that filter again, if you will.
Yeah, it goes back to the don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Do some kind of assessment. Just because you can't come up with a perfect one doesn't shouldn't prevent you from doing some kind of assessment as to whether the process was valuable, whether you accomplished your goals. Because it allows you to improve. It allows you to do it better the next time. Yeah.
Right.
So threat modeling, while as we talked about at the beginning, can be as simple as walking out of the cave and looking around to see if there's a saber-toothed tiger around. Uh, we've evolved a little bit from that point to a series of frameworks. And in fact, these aren't the only frameworks that are out there, but the whole point of a threat modeling framework is to give you signpost guidance in order to conduct that threat modeling exercise in an effective and meaningful way. So there are multiple, and we're going to pick Stride, as is implied from the title of the session, for our little exercise. But we wanted to illustrate that there are multiple out there. So Stride, Pasta, Maestro, Octave, they're all great names, and they all have different focuses or different purposes. So if we break that down just a little bit, Stride is more threat focused, so it's kind of targeting those threat categories, if you will, whereas Pasta is more risk based, sort of attacker centric. Maestro is more logic and behavior modeling oriented, and Octave is really about organizational risk. So you can pick and choose the framework based on what you think might be most appropriate for your threat modeling scenario, but also based on what might be most appropriate for your organization and how they're likely to interpret results and get work done. Um, and then we included here sort of strength and weaknesses for APIs specifically, because these threat models, they're not specific to APIs, right? They're broadly applicable, for cybersecurity and beyond cybersecurity in many cases. But we're talking about APIs here. So, Stride, great for quickly identifying attack types at endpoints. We're going to use Stride as our example here. Pasta, you might find better for analyzing abuse paths or multi-step attacks, that kind of thing. Maestro might be a better fit if you're talking about business logic issues, the business logic abuse top 10 as an example. And Octave is great in a regulated environment if you've got organizational risk to deal with as well. Um, so they all have strengths for APIs. There are some weaknesses too. Stride is really easy to get started with and really easy to understand, but it doesn't include that business or attacker context necessarily. Pasta is a little more heavy and time intensive. Maestro isn't as broadly understood, so it's less familiar to teams who are doing threat modeling. Octave, being organization specific, is less technology specific, so less API specific. But the whole point there is that you've got a plethora of options for threat modeling frameworks to choose from. and you can pick and choose the one that makes the most sense for your situation. Our situation today is a webinar about API threat modeling, so we're going to talk about Stride because we get to pick the framework. I don't know, Bob, was there anything you specifically wanted to add about Stride before we dive into the details?
Yeah, I think you covered it. It's why, it's kind of made for mass market appeal, if you will, right?
Yeah,
It covers a lot of different bases.
and it's been
Your
around for a
mouth
long time, right?
it has, and your mileage will vary, right? As you develop your threat modeling program, you may try different models out. You may understand that hey, we this works a little bit better for us, and tools as well, right? I mean, we didn't really talk about tools, but this can be there's software that you can use to do this, and those types of things. I think it's go back to the basics, and I think that's going to be a repeating theme here, but. This
Hmm.
keeps it simple, it's straightforward, and it's applicable to many different verticals and processes.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why I like Stride as an example. Even for, fairly mature organizations, one of the challenges that I often see is process over engineering. I don't know if you see that, Bob, as well, but people will come in and they say, well, I really love this particular process. It's complicated, but it's great for all these different reasons, but they find that the organization just can't really adopt a complex process. And so the end result is that they don't accomplish the objective, and they might have gotten further with a simpler process, even though it's not as flexible or as effective on paper, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So Stride, if you don't know, Stride an acronym, so that you can remember all the components easily. That's the idea. And we're going to go through some specific examples, with a scenario, but you've got spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. So the idea is that you're going to walk through each of those elements, those attributes, and talk about the threats that might arise in those cases. And it's broken down with a threat that violates a principle at the end. So spoofing violates authentication, tampering violates integrity, et cetera, as you can read. And we'll see these attributes again as we go through our example. So before we get started, Bob, when you do a workshop around threat modeling, you talk about prerequisites. What do you need in order to get started? So what are those prerequisites that you should be prepared with?
Sure. So typically in a workshop, I'm coming with some out of the box scenarios that I can kind of pull into the conversation. But really, when it's really meaningful is to have an environment from the customer that is critical, is about to change, it's something new. So some type of objective to what we're trying to do in that modeling exercise and scope as well. So what is the process? What is the application? And very often we're going to need to narrow that down. To your point, these complex processes. We want to get this down to like a user story, a use case, a data flow, if you will, because in some of these very complex systems, you really got to get it down to a manageable subcomponent that you can actually measure and discuss without kind of really getting into the weeds. And that's where these architecture diagrams and data flow diagrams really come into place, where we can focus in. There may be some threats that are outside of that scope, and we can kind of put those off to the side and do that on another day or in another session. But really narrowing down, we're looking at this specific API, we're looking at this specific user story, use case, to really make it palatable and get some value out of it.
Mhm, mhm. So when you talk about objectives, before we move into the data flow piece of it, what
Sure.
like what makes a good objective? What's a bad objective when you talk about threat modeling? Do you have a couple of
Yeah.
examples that come to mind or that you can invent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we want to focus these types of engagements and conversations, right? It's so easy to get mired down, and we have a slide a little bit later that shows kind of a data flow diagram that illustrates this. But it's so easy to try to fix everything all at once, encompass the entire universe of what we're doing, and include these things. So I think when we talk about the objective, we're really trying to figure out what's the end result. What is there, especially if it's time bound and measurable. Can we sit down in the next 2 hours and get through this exercise and come up with this output? That output might be specific risks and threats that we find with mitigations, and then also that actionable kind of thing that we want to be able to do at the end of this.
Hmm.
Um,
hmm Yeah, yeah. I think both, I mean, all of these prerequisites are important, but having a clear objective, prevents that distraction, people going off on tangents. Having a scope ensures that people stay within that scope, or at least gives you the ability to try to do that. All of that, as you were describing, I think is critical to allowing the activity to come to a conclusion, a valuable conclusion, to produce an output that can be actionable. Right? Otherwise, you can end up with sort of an infinite loop of threat modeling, if you will. You never finish.
totally, totally.
So we were talking a little bit about architecture and data flow, and that can also be a complicated topic, right? So where are the pitfalls to avoid in that sort of data flow and architecture discussion?
Yeah, so this is an interesting data flow diagram because it's so detailed that it becomes unusable, right? This would take a year to dissect and model all the combinations and permutations of trust boundaries and exploitable interfaces and all these things. So, this goes back to that scope conversation. Let's keep it focused. I know it's the reaction or the reflexes to, well, we want to look at the entire thing and have a broad look at this, and that's true. But you really have to start to do this in bite-sized pieces so you can actually get something out of it.
Yeah, and I
So
think if you end up with if you start that process of collecting the data flow diagram or building it, and you end up with something that looks like this, is that an opportunity to go back to the objective and the scope and say, do we need to narrow it down further?
absolutely. Yeah. I think, there are, models and Visio documents and data flow diagrams that look like this out in the wild. And they probably make sense to some people, but it's really just not an actionable kind of artifact for our purposes.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you think about a map in general, you can't find your way to a specific address when you're looking at the entire country, right?
Right.
You've got to
Right.
zoom in order to make some progress. And I think that's valuable. So, you know, we're talking about simplified data flow diagrams, something that looks a bit more like this, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it can be on a whiteboard, it can be using a tool. There's plenty of free tools out there to be able to diagram and model your use cases for sure. But simple is better. You can always add detail as you go with from the input of the subject matter experts and the key stakeholders that are in the actual activity.
Yeah, and we've got on this diagram a trust boundary, which is worth pointing out and talking about a little bit because it's a focus for threat modeling. So, what does that trust boundary indicate? What does that mean? How do you decide where to put those?
Sure. Yeah, and it can be different depending on the application or the scope of what we're doing. But in essence, it's kind of delineating an entity or an area where we have some level of control, and from an area that we have less control, if you will. This could be a third party. It could be very often a user,
Hmm.
where they're putting in some input or manipulating some component, and we can't control everything that they're doing. And that it's just an area of focus where things should be monitored, things can be manipulated or changed. Almost, we use these terms like exploitable interface. Where can some outside entity make some manipulate something?
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So let's get started with our threat modeling exercise that we've sort of planned for this session. And we're going to use a fictional company called TZ Does It, which sells tea and accessories online. And in this exercise that we're talking about in this example, We're planning on introducing a new feature to the TZ Does It site and web application, which is an AI-powered recommendation engine. Everybody's putting AI into everything, so we figured our fictional company should probably do the same thing. So the scenario here is that we're replacing an old recommendation engine with a new one that uses generative and agentic AI. It's going to use ChatGPT to provide recommendations for other products when you're on a product page. It's going to add recommendations to search results, and it's going to add sponsored recommendations from partners. So there are a couple new functions here or new APIs that we're introducing. There's a get recommendations API and a new search API as well. So that's the high level. If you think about me as sort of the product manager, that's my description. If you think of Bob maybe as the engineer or the technical product manager, this is sort of the goals and technology view. So Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about what we're planning for our fictional venture here?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Tim, we want to use the latest and greatest technology. We want to be able to put in our shareholder earnings calls that we're using AI, and this is important to us. So we're replacing this what I would consider more of a static recommendations based off of just the product database and kind of what's out there, and we're giving that a little bit more autonomy through the model context protocol, where we're using agentic AI to go out and reach out to these different systems to decide for us, based off of our past history, our search history, partner integration, and then also the generative AI component through ChatGPT. How do we have like a concierge recommendation for our customers? So when they're searching, it's no longer looking at a single database or looking at a single source of information that's just static and has only our products in it. We're opening it up so that we can get more customized interaction. Drive a lot more user engagement, those types of things.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's our definition of scope, really. We've got the new API, the old API, the recommendation engine, those third-party APIs that we're interacting with in the product catalog, and we've gone to the effort of drawing our diagram, our data flow diagram here, and that's our scope for this threat modeling exercise. The next step is to talk about the trust boundaries. So let me add those in. And then Bob, you want to talk about these trust boundaries and why we put them where we did?
Sure, absolutely. And this can be up to interpretation, right? And it's the idea of kind of moving forward and getting something done. You can really overanalyze this and say, well, we should have micro segmentation between all these components, and that's technically a trust boundary. But I would say from a data flow perspective, we have our customer, which they're coming in. That component can be unregulated, unrestricted, what have you. We also have ChatGPT, as our Gen AI platform that we're using. So we don't exactly control all of the components that are happening there. And then on the third-party APIs as well, we are sending requests, we're getting responses. We may have some additional input and controls we can put around that, but by and large, we're not controlling every variable on the other side of those trust boundaries. Right?
Yeah, and I think you didn't say it explicitly, but so I'll go back to the when we talked about the definition of a trust boundary. Areas of lower trust to areas of higher trust. That's just what you described there, right? The customer, we have less control, less trust. They're coming into the area that we control inside our application, so that creates a trust boundary. And I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and do you see this as kind of an area where it's a point of inflection, right? It's not that only bad things can happen there, right? But it's a great place to start.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also a point where we can exert control. I think that's important, right? Although we can exert control in lots of places, but these are points where we can, potentially implement a mitigation,
Right.
as well. Yeah, yeah, good. Okay,
Totally.
so we'll dive in with the first of the stride attributes, the S, which stands for spoofing. So let's talk a little bit about the potential for spoofing across these trust boundaries. I think I don't know, Bob. Where do you want to start with that? Do you want to start with a particular thought?
Yeah, I mean, customer side is always a good place to start.
Yeah,
Obviously, what can an unauthenticated user get to? What can an authenticated user get to? Can we do we have a situation where credential stuffing attacks or password spraying attacks could get someone in to be able to do an account takeover, um,
yeah.
and masquerade as another user, that
Yeah,
type of
there's
stuff.
there's a host of, I mean, I think that's the place that most people jump to, when they think about threat modeling, is what can the customer do?
Right.
And you named a bunch of the potential spoofing related attacks that could occur there. I think account takeover is probably a big one to worry about. If we follow our fictional retail company, effectively our e-commerce company, account takeover is a big deal for e-commerce companies, right? It's a significant problem, and it's one that definitely exists. So we we definitely have a potential threat to deal with for customer account takeover there. I'd agree. Um, any other customer ones that we want to talk about? There is, one question I have here, given our model, do we have, well, actually, no, we'll save that for a different spot before I jump ahead.
Okay.
Um, uh, what about this Chat GPT trust boundary? Is there something there that we should worry about?
Yeah. How are we authenticating?
Hmm.
Obviously we have some type of enterprise subscription there. Um, I
So we've
think
got a
that,
non-human identity to deal
right.
with across that boundary. Yeah,
Yeah. And
for sure.
enforcing that, can I masquerade as that user or non-human identity? Um, that's important. And that would, obviously from a API authentication perspective on a third party APIs as well, right? How are we controlling those secrets? Are we rotating them? What are the parameters around there?
Yeah, yeah. And I think for the folks watching, if you have thoughts about about threats that we should consider while we go through it, feel free to pop them into the chat on LinkedIn or into the chat on Zoom, depending on which one you're on, as we talk through these. Um, you're welcome to join in and influence the conversation as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So, from a spoofing perspective, we talked about this trust boundary with customers. We talked about this one with ChatGPT. There's obviously the third one here with the third-party APIs, um, and I think there are probably similar spoofing related threats there for us to consider.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, definitely.
Are we holding those third parties to a specific a specific category of authentication or requirements? Obviously there's an integration point there. There's a trust boundary there. Or, if we have weak authentication to one third party and good authentication to another, is there some standardization that we're holding those third
Yeah,
parties to?
standardization. That's an interesting
Yeah.
one, actually, to talk about there. Yeah. Okay, good. So let's I think we could spend more time on here, but we've got a few others to go through. So
Yeah.
let's jump ahead to tampering. One of my favorites here to talk about. We still got the same trust boundaries, right? I really like to talk about these third-party APIs and the threats of tampering, because you've got some fun things over here like rewards and promo codes and reviews. And so, immediately I think about the threat of manipulating reviews. Like, is there a way that an attacker can um, exploit this connection to generate fake reviews or alter reviews, and then the reuse of promo codes or rewards. That's another one that that comes to mind for me in terms of the tampering uh, piece of Stride.
Yeah, and in the wild we see a lot of that, right? Manipulating store credit systems or reward
Mm.
systems, promo codes. From a fraud perspective, it's just it typically is a great way for a low to mid skill attacker to get, they don't have to sell any information, they don't have to do anything. They can really just go in there and say, look, I'm gonna start issuing myself store credit. By the time they find me, I'll be long gone. Or I can parlay that into, some other platform, airline miles or, Visa gift cards or iTunes accounts or whatever.
Hmm.
So that's something, ultimately somebody has to pay for that. And understanding where those threats are, where those risks are, and also goes back to what is the motivation there, right? I mean, there's a lot of financially motivated attackers, and this is just well, we think of this typically as being a value add for a customer or a part of the business that we're doing. There's always that potential for fraud and abuse.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So if we take a look at, oh, I skipped one, didn't I? Tampering, no, repudiation. So I know
Yep.
repudiation is one of your favorites, I
Yeah,
think.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let's chat a little bit about that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, double negative conversations that you can kind of tie yourself into a knot with when you have it. But if you think about it as the security camera, right? My Ring doorbell sees that Tim came to my door and, put a nasty note on my front door, right? And Tim says, "Well, I didn't do it." And I can prove that you did it because I have you on video. And it's this idea of attribution, right?
Yeah, yeah,
How do we confirm or prove that somebody did something and their defense can't be, well, that wasn't me or I didn't do it or whatever. So that's really kind of where we get into these
yeah,
repudiation, non-repudiation conversations. Um, it could be an account, back to the account takeover conversation. How do we prove that this person uh, isn't or is who they say they are? And that might
sure.
be, there might be some components in the application where we're trusting that it's just a username and password. They get in, they make some changes, they have a saved credit card, and they're making purchases, and it may be a stolen identity. And
Yeah.
how do we navigate those waters?
I feel like conversations around non-repudiation or repudiation often come back to, logging and log manipulation, right? So it's, do we have sufficient logging to identify who undertook an action? And uh, is that logging secure enough that an attacker can't manipulate it? Because,
Right.
classic attacker scenario is go do a bunch of stuff and then, delete the log so that people don't know what you did.
Yep, I'm going to
Uh,
sweep up behind me as I leave. I'm going to kind of cover my tracks, if you will. Yeah, absolutely. And it really starts kind of early in the process where do we actually have the telemetry that's coming from, say, it's a mobile application. There's a lot of data that's coming from these mobile applications that we can use. They may not be, very useful in the normal flow of the application, but from a attribution after the fact perspective, we
mhm.
tell where this user is coming from. Are there heuristics that we can pull off of this device above and beyond user agents, those types of things.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So that's repudiation. Let's talk a little bit about information disclosure. So
Always a favorite. Yeah.
yeah, I mean there are lots of ways here. Obviously, if you start by just looking at the data flow and saying, well, where's the information? Where's the
Right.
data? Then you have a catalog of things that could potentially be disclosed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in our example here, we're going from this, the old or existing API is straight up, the search dialogue. We're going against the product catalog, which is very well controlled. And now we're giving some autonomy to the MCP client and server and the agentic AI workflows. We're tying in these predefined prompts and services that can go out and pull all this information in. So we're really have broadened the scope of where that information could be. And we're, one thing, to point out too, we're also, this is with this new change, we're giving access to the customer profile, right?
Yeah,
And, you know,
that's right.
I think that's something that just wasn't there previously. So now there might be some more sensitive information that's there.
And there's some really interesting API related threats there, risks there to talk about. So, first of all, you've got things like BOLA, broken object level authorization. So can I can I, as a one user, request information from another user's profile just by changing their user ID, for example, in the request? Or, server-side request forgery, can I get a trusted entity inside the architecture to go get the data for me?
Right.
There's a potential for AI manipulation there too. That's an interesting angle as well. And then, the product catalog is also a source that people need to consider in this case, right? So do I have unpublished products that people aren't supposed to have access to until a certain date? Or do I have pricing for products that people aren't supposed to have access to? Price scraping, a big challenge for retail
Sure.
as well. And I think those threats for disclosure are significant and worth mitigating in this scenario.
Yeah, I think anytime we're putting these convenience type features in, or these value added type features in, where we're really trying to be a concierge for the customer, we, just by the nature of that, we have to have um, almost overly permissive access to a lot of different data sources.
Hmm.
And there's a lot to be said around how do we put guardrails on that? How do we
Yeah,
restrict um, what they can and can't see, either on purpose or by accident, right?
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. So denial of service, we're almost at the end of the stride list here. So denial of service, there are lots of opportunities for denial of service here. And I think I always like to emphasize the distinction between distributed denial of service, which gets a lot of attention in the press, DDoS, right? And denial of service on, more specific applications or endpoints or microservices. So here, I don't think the distributed denial of service is in scope, but what are the opportunities for denial of service on a smaller but still impactful level?
Sure. Yeah. If we look at this data flow, we can identify again changes that are being made to the environment where um, we may have third party solutions like ChatGPT where maybe we can exhaust that connection.
Yeah.
Um,
Like if we're using tokens, if we have a
right.
limited number of tokens, someone could manipulate the flow to exhaust those tokens, and then the function no longer works.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
It's only as strong as the weakest link in the chain, right? So, whether it's a distributed denial of service attack or it's just one very tiny subcomponent
Hmm.
of the application, if that component is required to check out or process a credit card or what have you, overrunning those resources can be just as impactful as a massive, multi
Yeah.
continental denial of service attack, right? It's
Sure. Yeah. Overloading on the number of requests to the third-party APIs is also a potential issue there. You know,
absolutely, yeah,
yeah, that's a threat to worry about too. Definitely.
yeah. And what's the maybe we'll get into this one in elevation of privilege, but what's the result of that overload, right? Is there
Mm,
some error handling issue that we can disclose something from or manipulate or what have you?
yeah. Well, that's a reasonable transition, right? So, yeah, it might just be a denial of service, but it might also lead to an elevation of privilege.
Right.
Yeah. And I think this is the one where the AI component is most interesting to me, because you've got the opportunity to abuse ChatGPT and the components in that flow to get access to information you're not supposed to have, to elevate privilege in that sense. And we talked a little bit about that in our prep. There is a prompt manipulation via search opportunity here or threat that you're going to want to talk about. How do you mitigate that?
Yeah, prompt injection is huge. Obviously, there's tons of documentation and cases where that's been a problem. And I think with any of these new technologies, the human nature is to kind of start the fire, and then we don't really learn from it until we burn our fingers, right? So a lot of times these deployments are you know user friendly, let's make it easy for the user, and security often takes a back seat, and maybe it's a little overly permissive. And then just by the nature of agentic AI, we're going from this structured deterministic API, I send you this, I expect this response back. It's very logic based and repeatable and deterministic to agents where we're basically empowering it through these predefined prompts and preferences and all of these different sources to go out and solve a problem for us somewhat autonomously, right? We're giving it a little bit of a boundary and some guidelines to go do this thing, but the emphasis, get me an answer versus follow this procedure. And that obviously opens itself up to things where maybe we can embed or encode some language in that search function as a customer or
Yeah.
a nefarious third party that can be passed through and manipulated or be interpreted downstream as go get something else, right? Can we use that chat GPT connection for our own purposes? Can I
Hmm.
embed some prompt in there that's going to get me answers for some other unrelated searches that I want to do? And now we're using this company's infrastructure and money and subscription to to do a bunch of our own type of work, or can
Yeah.
we convince that MCP server to divulge something that lets us, elevate that privilege and do
Yeah.
something even more?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, those are important considerations. There's also I'm a big fan of the basics, doing the basics right. So there's one other consideration when we talk about elevation of privilege that I think is important is are there any administrative interfaces here to consider? We have not. This might go back to drawing the data flow diagram in the first place, but we've created the customer entity, but we haven't necessarily outlined where there might be API endpoints that um, provide an opportunity for administrative access from that customer viewpoint that uh, you know uh, need to be protected as well.
Right. OWASP would call this, function level authorization, right?
Right.
If I'm an enroll user, can I, take some actions and expose some, maybe in the case of an API, some methods or endpoints that aren't required for my use case,
Yeah.
but they're still out there, right? They've either been deprecated or they're just out there by default, and we're not monitoring that
Yeah.
or controlling that, right?
Yeah. 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 So we've talked a lot about the threats, which is certainly part of the threat mitigation equation, if you will. But let's talk about some mitigations, because obviously the point here is not just to enumerate threats; it's to talk about how do we do something about them. And we're not going to go through everything we just talked about, given the time constraints, but we wanted to give some examples. So if we start with the information disclosure threats as a good starting place. Remember, we talked about, extracting other individuals' customer profile data or extracting unpublished products. We talked a little bit about, uh, uh, the just specific exploits involved there. What are the potential mitigations that we could consider for that information disclosure risks that we talked about?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, one of the, understanding the administrative interfaces, understanding the debugging and logging components, those types of things. I think that's one area where if we should be restricting those from the normal use from a user perspective, right? When we're in QA or dev or lower environments, these debug interfaces and these error handling components are very important. But we want to make sure that we're not overexposing those and we're controlling, monitoring for those types of things because very often you can get that endpoint to or that system to divulge a little bit more than they should,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
that kind of cascades, right?
yeah,
You touched on the BOLA, right?
yeah,
Object level authorization and authentication. I think if we just kind of kind of take a step back and really the OWASP API top 10, the web application top 10, any of these, right, are going to, uh, you know, some baseline to be able to be at least measuring for these types of threats. And you really need to have some type of API security system in place to be able to really do this, right? No one's going to go through the logs and look for this
yeah.
stuff. It's just,
Well, I think there are two ways to approach that, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? One is to go to your developers and educate them on those types of vulnerabilities and how to avoid them in the code itself. And
Right.
then two is to put in place a security control, like you said, as an API security tool that can detect and block those types of attacks. And you want to do, people like the phrase shift left, but it really is shift left, shield right. You got to do both
Right.
sides of the equation, and I think that's valuable here.
Yeah,
Um,
and one informs the other, right? What are we seeing in
correct.
the wild? What are we seeing attempts that are blocked? Hey, if they would have just put this parameter in a little bit differently, maybe it would have gotten through. Let's go
Yeah.
back, you know, to
And
the
if you have great API specifications, there is an opportunity here to enforce those specifications. So if you block anything that doesn't match the spec, you
yeah.
can potentially control for some of that information disclosure, from APIs that offer up too much information potentially.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Cybersecurity 101, right? Inventory management.
Yeah.
In our case, we have that, we still have that old search interface, right? That's going directly against the product. Do we have a plan to remove that, or are we just going to kind of let it lay out there and
Eh,
not put any security controls on it because
Yeah.
that's going to become an increasing risk for us
Yeah.
as we move on. So yeah, having understanding and have that visibility into what you actually have out there is such a critical first step to be able to start drawing these boundaries.
Well, and that's a good transition to the elevation of privilege mitigations because we talked about administrative interfaces here. And just having an API discovery capability, inventory capability that says, here are all the APIs that are exposed, gives
Right.
you that ability to control access to the interfaces that shouldn't be available or that should be restricted. And you can't do that if you don't know they're there. So that certainly falls into this category of mitigations as well.
Yeah, I mean, and really, sanitizing inputs and responses as well. Are
Hmm.
we, are we testing against some barometer for the inputs that the users are able to put into a search field or in some HTTP header or cookie or whatever, right? Are we
Yeah.
are we kind of limiting that so that we can kind of control that on the front end? And then on the response side, are we sending back an entire object with a bunch of superfluous information that isn't really needed for the user to get its job done? And if someone is looking for that, they can kind of harvest some of the information, right? Are we controlling that and narrowing the scope of what's getting sent, responding? I think that's one of those things. Again, you need the visibility to see what is actually getting sent, what is actually coming back, and then what are the parameters. And the
Hmm.
it kind of lends itself to this positive security model. Like, what does good look like, right? If we never see a request that's over 64 characters, then why should we allow a request over 64 characters or what have you?
Yeah. Yeah. The last one we wanted to talk about was the denial of service. And I think what I really want to talk about with the denial of service is rate limiting because the ideal scenario is that the application itself does rate limiting, for its component APIs and interfaces. But the reality is that it often doesn't. And so having a capability in place, whether it's an API security tool or an API gateway or something else that allows you to enforce rate limiting as a security control, gives you the ability not only to respond to potential denial of service conditions, but also to prevent them from occurring. I think that's a highly valuable piece for a mitigation standpoint.
Yeah, yeah. And whether that's on a session basis or user basis
Mm.
or what have
Yeah,
you, right? And going back to that exhaustion of a bunch of Gen AI tokens, if one user is a huge outlier in using up these AI tokens, that's something we'd
that,
want to be warned about, right?
yeah, that is a
At a
critical
minimum.
point, actually. Yeah, rate limiting is not all the same, right? Being able to rate limit by different parameters makes a big difference in terms of how you can respond. Very
Correct.
important.
Yeah. And bot because it lends itself into bot management, right? Price
It does.
scrapers, those types of things, and user pattern, normal user pattern behavior is not, very often is well within that rate limiting parameter, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, great. So that brings us back to the stride definition here that I'll put up again. Just to answer one of the questions I saw come across, the coloring here is not indicative of anything other than alternating rows. So if you were looking for greater meaning in the similar colors in the diagrams, the data flow diagrams to the chart, that's not that was pure styling, not intended to communicate anything in particular. So I know
Yeah,
we do have a couple. Yeah, go ahead,
I
Bob.
was going to say, are we going to go? If we can go through the questions, I saw
Yeah,
one was, can you use the wrong threat model? I guess, the answer is yes, right? If you're trying to threat model something that is just that the model's not built for, specifically like the Maestro is built for AI, and if we're trying to do server hardening, you might get some value out of it. But I think that's why we really start with Stride. It's worth taking a look at different models. It's worth kind of walking through and kind of modeling the model, if you will, and having a conversation about it. But I would say at a high level, it's better to do something, even if it's with the quote unquote wrong model, than it is to just kind of over analyze which, the process of doing it, right? You can really kind of get into this. Well, we need to stand up a whole program around threat modeling. We need to buy software to do this. We need to have a committee to figure out what model we're using. It's better to kind of just jump in and start doing it, and you'll figure it out as you go, right? Things will make more sense. You'll develop a pattern.
yeah, yeah. Continuous improvement.
Yeah.
One other question that came across, the Microsoft threat modeling tool hasn't been updated since 2016. Are there any UI tools that you particularly like, Bob, when you're doing threat modeling workshops?
Yeah, I won't endorse any specific ones, but there's a few out there. Threat Dragon, the Microsoft one comes up a lot. I find that having the right people in the room and having that kind of this open collaborative forum is way more important than any specific tool. I would say the best tool you really that's out there is a whiteboard and some whiteboard markers, right? And a conference room and some pizza, or a lunch. A lot of times at Driven when we do these, we're bringing in lunch and we're kind of sitting around a conference table and it's very collaborative. Again, you can really get mired down in the process and methodology is great, but actually doing these things and getting value out of it is way more important.
Yeah, good. So I know we're at the end of our time, and we actually didn't get to answer all of the questions. So we'll try and come back. If you put them on LinkedIn, we'll try and come back through the comments and provide an answer there in text as well. But I want to thank you, Bob, for participating in this webinar. I think it was pretty interesting and a good conversation. I hope everyone who attended got a little something out of it as well. So thank you for spending your time with us too. Um, yeah, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody.
All right, cheers. Thanks, everyone.